And I feel like you really went to the center, the heart of the matter, which is the tendency of white socialization and white culture and white people to not see the humanity in people of color. And it's painful to say that out loud.
Don't talk about me without me. It rhymes and it's really cute, but it makes total sense. And it is the correcting sort of the white savior industrial complex. One, diversity, that word, that understanding, that concept is very Eurocentric anyways. The nature of wanting to increase the equity and justice and reaching out, urban outreach and certain kinds of schools, I won't say specific, that talk about grit and rigor and how they're going into inner cities and they're going to do this for the kids and stuff. And they tell the tragic stories of inner city kids. But the people who are coming up with this stuff are not from the communities of these inner city kids.
Exactly.
And the concept or the idea of designing a solution for a population that you're not a part of and that you don't understand, it's already an inherently flawed and oppressive and racist because
Fear of the Free Child is a weekly podcast that centers
diverse narratives, insightful commentary,
learning with our children and deschooling ourselves, owning our multiple identities and treating children with dignity,
creating community and sharing conversation from often silenced spaces,
breathing life into liberation practices proactively and on purpose.
The paradox of education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is being educated. James Baldwin. It is said that Baldwin's language seemed purposely chosen to shock and shake the reader into a concerned state of action. In other words, he chose his words, both written and spoken, with great care, in part because he used words to incite change. I too write and speak to incite. I mentioned James Baldwin in this episode because he's up there on my radical selfie list. That's my list of beings who didn't cloud their assertions with undue apologies or tread lightly so as not to offend. If I focused on offenses, then my eyes would have to veer away from my people and the ways we suffer, and the ways that we even participate in that suffering by centering the white gaze. And I cannot afford to do that. Even if I was designed in a way that leaned towards that, my experiences have groomed me otherwise. In the first episode of this podcast, which I published on July 9th of 2016, I said that I started Fear of the Free Child to create a community that would inspire other communities to be formed, where adults engaged in unconventional Black and Brown parenting and caregiving could be heard and could find and support each other. Because there are so few spaces where Black folk and Brown folk can speak honestly, can come plain with it, as Mos Def once said, about the ways in which we suffer without being policed by the voices that are uncomfortable with their participation in our long-standing issues. I can't half create a safe space. It's either safe or it ain't. So I want to have the conversations out loud that Black folks in all our iterations all over the world have been having amongst ourselves for years. And I also want to have them out loud because our children and we intersect and interact in real life and online, whether you're Black, white, or whatever. These conversations make room for us to expand our understandings of each other and, equally important, of our options outside of the standard fucked up education system. And by options, I don't mean cheaper private school or a less shitty charter school. I mean our options outside of all of that. I am not of the belief that the system is broken. It works exactly how it's supposed to work. It's our belief system that's broken, because we believe that if we can get our children to play the game right, they might end up better off than us in adulthood. They won't. They might have nicer things, but they'll face the same real issues. Maybe we feel that getting our children as far away from poverty, which is tied to lack of education, is the solution. And I agree with that. But what I don't agree with is that we got to put them on new age auction blocks to be examined and tested and spun around and made to do shit that has nothing to do with their real value and their infinite potential to build, to collaborate, to excel, to create, to be amazing. The system is not designed to facilitate that. And so here on Fear of the Free Child podcast, we lament, we build, we highlight the spaces and the people where solutions are being explored and implemented. And we also talk about the barriers and the cost of choosing education that is based on real learning, not systemic indoctrination. We also, of course, talk about racism, because that is one of the big, bad barriers to raising free people. And in talking about it, centering ourselves and welcoming allies who are willing to listen and to learn and to follow our lead, we are creating social change. And we can't do that curtsying and shit. We can't do that afraid to step on toes. We can't do that if we shy away from our truths because they make people feel bad. Feeling bad ain't got shit on being targeted and hurt or killed or left out or singled out simply because other people have developed and the world has normalized a false fear-based perspective of our people. So in this episode, we come real plain with it. I'm happy to offer up this dialogue where one return guest and one new one are brave enough and human enough to nurture safe space with me. Anthony Galloway was on episode 19. He is one of the founders of Heartwood Agile Learning Center in Clarkston, Georgia, a suburb of Atlanta. He's a graduate of Morehouse College, a believer in nurturing learning, and a longtime educator and facilitator. He used to facilitate at a Sudbury school and then joined forces with some other self-directed education-minded folks to create their own learning space using the Agile learning model. If you want to learn more about that model, Anthony's other episode, again, that's episode number 19, as well as episode 5 with Janita Castro, speak very much to that model. In this episode, I'm joined by one of the people who co-founded Heartwood ALC along with Anthony, and that's Julia Cordero. Julia has been in education for more than 20 years, both in the private school setting and also at a public access TV station where she directed a youth program for teens, among other ventures. And in this episode, she is helping to nurture safe space by offering up some real candor around her own baggage and biases and talking about her willingness to face them and to do something about the lack of Black and brown faces at Heartwood ALC, including on their board and on their staff. The show notes page for this episode is akilasrichards.com/plain, PLAIN. And I'll list some resources related specifically to this episode on that page, so be sure to check that out too. And I'd really love to see your comments on SoundCloud as you process this conversation. You can also tweet your feedback using the hashtag POC in SDE, as in people of color in self-directed education. I'd love to know your thoughts. So here we are. We start our conversation by talking about a diversity and inclusion sort of fund that Julia and Anthony applied for and got, and we're talking about where they are in that process.
Oh, the work is never done. We're not really finished yet.
Okay. I thought there was like a specific program or something like that you were doing, or some sort of fellowship.
Yeah, it is. We have to submit our exit plan shortly, like within the next few weeks, and how we want to spend the remaining funds. But we're able to extend like the expenditure of the funds over whatever period of time we think is most appropriate.
Okay, well that's really like one of the main things that I wanted to talk about, because as I've mentioned a few times, even on the podcast, I love the movement. I feel so connected to it. I think it's a refreshing and necessary space, and it's really good to help with that transition. I think the layout of Agile learning really lends itself to an opportunity for us to transition, for those of us who have been more immersed in the traditional models, in a way that I think is really helpful. But I know that a lot of the centers are saying a similar thing, that the affordability factor, and I know specifically with where you guys are in Clarkston, is such a diverse area. I think I found out from Leslie, who runs a homeschooling and unschooling space there, that it's like designated as one of the most diverse neighborhoods in Metro Atlanta. But I know that it would still be cost prohibitive to the majority of the people who are right there in the community that you guys are in. And I know that's something that you guys were really sensitive about and that you were looking to do something about. So I just wanted to, kind of see where you are with that and what's been happening in that space for you guys.
I think it's actually two different topics. The reason that Clarkston is so diverse is because it's a refugee population. Mm-hmm. And as we can look at like in the umbrella of diversity and inclusion, which is a huge umbrella, what we've kind of been focusing on specifically is increasing enrollment of families of color and increasing enrollment of having a wider socioeconomic spread. So the refugee population, I think, is sort of its own subject. It's different. And I would say the articulation we have on that right now is just around, and some of this is an assumption to be tested, of course, but that when you come to America and you cannot speak the language and you don't have the resources you had most of the times in your place of home or place of birth, that self-directed learning environment is maybe not the fastest way to get to the assimilation you might need to be able to maneuver.
I see what you're saying. Yes, in terms of the folks who are interested in an SDE space, there isn't necessarily a direct correlation between the community that you're in and that particular population of people or subset of people who are looking for that sort of space and saying, oh, I can't afford it even though I'm interested in it. There's not necessarily a direct correlation. That's what I hear you saying?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. I mean, okay. A lot of what we think, and we're exploring the community that we're in and trying to understand, just integrating into a refugee community is really hard because, especially with all that's been going on politically, it's just like, it's a very strained balance because we are in a refugee community and we're not as integrated into it as we would like to be. And integrating into it it's sort of this very strange dynamic of we are looking to explore and become part of our community because that's what's good for us. That's a really weird position to be in. And even though we want to do things that are good for the community, it's not like we're walking in with cash donations, which is what's really relevant to that community, probably always, but particularly right now. So it's almost like we're requesting time from families and organizations so that we can be more diverse, if that makes sense, And so just maneuvering around that is like, so like one example is tomorrow we'll start this volunteer program with some refugee pre-primary students down the street at the church, which is beautiful and wonderful. And some of our older kids will go down there. And we've been trying to get into that program for like a good 5 or 6 weeks. And it's just full, like everybody's volunteering for that because there are so few places to enter into that environment when you're trying to do it with kids. So,
Interesting. Anthony, is there anything that you wanted to or can add to that?
There's so much to like become aware of and to try to unwork. It's a really difficult sort of thing to figure out or to really be sure about. I just recently on past Sunday listened to your interview with Dr. Scott Speed and it was just so great to hear him say and realize like a lot of the same things that I believe and understand, or to have some affirmation on some of those structures, because it's at the end of the day with schooling, us being a private school, the very first gateway or barrier is, money. So there's a thing. And then there's just all these other sort of unknown and maybe hidden ways in which we might be operating an exclusive space or creating a space that is exclusive. So I think right now we're aware that is and could be going on in ways that we don't even know yet. And we're actively trying to undo that. But it's really hard.
Sure. And it's interesting that you say a private school. So you see it as it's structured as a private school. Is that, as I tend to hear other ALC facilitators not call it a private school. So I'm curious about that perspective as well. Are you just talking about in terms of like the formal structure of it, the legal structure of it? Or?
Yeah, the formal legal structure. I mean, anything that isn't a, technically, I guess, anything that is not a public or public charter school is a private school if the admission has its own admissions process and it can turn people away and all of that. So I think everybody tries to avoid that term and they might go towards like independent school or something just because of what private school, the connotations with that. There's a class connotation.
Yeah.
And I think in some sectors, though, if you say independent, then for some people, there's a connotation that as an independent school is actually a private profit organization or company. You don't want to be associated with necessarily either of those ideas or thoughts, but I guess maybe the term isn't really out there yet.
Right. We have to create it. Yeah. And I get that. So what are some of the things that in terms of the folks who are there now? When I was there, I think there were, Anthony, I think you might be like shimmying a lot or something, because when you're talking, I'm hearing like a lot.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
That's okay. That I know there were just a few families of color who were there. Has there been an increase? Or maybe we can talk about some of the efforts that you have put into that level of accessibility, or maybe some of the successes that you've had with that, if any. Could we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So right now, like our plan, so we're sort of moving through the early parts of our plan, and that is really looking at the center of the organization and reworking from the center out. So we started out with just our board, talking to them about why we pursued the fellowship, what we wanted to do with the money in this initiative. And the board, they're supportive. We want them to not just be supportive of this initiative, but to actually sort of take it as their own and make it like their own mission as well. Mm-hmm. So the first step was to get a bylaw change. So in our bylaws and the principles that are listed, to add in a line specifically about diversity and inclusion and how it impacts and benefits and how it's necessary for our educational space, for our space. So now our organization is now principled on that and is built around that idea, and it will be a key theme, for years to come. So we saw that as the first thing, and then working on some of the culture of the school and getting our current community on board and getting everybody to buy in and opt in to this mission. We've had these diversity and inclusion workshops. One was back in February, I believe. And it was sort of part one, laying the groundwork and people expressing and sharing their personal stories as it relates to gender, socioeconomic status, and ethnicity. So it was a really great foundation. And that was for the board as well as just our parent community. Mm-hmm. We had every family at the school was represented there. And part two is coming up in April, and that'll be based on allyship and action plans and talking about privilege and how to have conversations with your kids about ethnicity.
Interesting. So do you get a lot of interest from parents of color? Have you seen that increase any since you've been sharing more on Facebook and doing the open houses and that sort of thing?
So we've got a regular sort of interest in families of color. They will come to an info session or email, and then sometimes there's like it falls off, or we don't, or there's no follow-up, or they don't take it, the step further. Mm-hmm. Julie and I, as a part of a larger initiative, and I guess I'll go over that too, our plans of making sure that there is a pathway and we're clearing the pathway for families of color to become a part of the school and to join our school community. We've thought about like how we do outreach and marketing. For us, thus far, for us and for a lot of the other ALCs, a lot of the new enrollment and stuff comes from sort of word of mouth. So there's somebody here, there's a friend there tabling this event. And so we're aware of those, that in sharing, you're more likely, you're sharing with your pre-existing community, and with our initial families being largely white families, middle-class families, they're sharing with other families with similar demographics.
Right.
So we have a plan to intentionally share outside of our networks and stuff. We just have not, just being busy and stuff, but we haven't done much or any outreach or marketing outside of the occasional Facebook ad.
Yeah.
Plan to table events and go out and be in communities that are specifically events in communities that predominantly people of color, and exposing ourselves intentionally to people outside of our current family's existing networks. Those sessions and open houses, in visits to the school, we're hoping by that we would get, more and different people. And then also our plan is actually something we did just finish is following up with families of color who have expressed interest, who have visited the school, but for some reason didn't fully enroll or didn't do a trial week to see what factors were in the way, what was what was stopping them, so that if it's something that we can address, if it's an issue that we think might be repetitive, or if it's related to class and ethnicity, us thinking of ways to undo that and make it that path easier. We're also aware. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, exactly what you're saying, because I know that, and just having spoken to folks who run other ALCs as well, a very similar thing where it's a lot of word of mouth. So you're just going to get basically more white people telling other white people, which doesn't address the issue of the diversity at all. And then there's a lot of inquiry that outside looking in, I'm thinking needs to happen to see what are those barriers, exactly what you just said, to follow up with the folks who may show some interest but don't come to a trial week or something like that, so that we're not just assuming that it's financial or, whatever the thing is, but really being clear on what those things are, because as we know, there are many, many layers to it. A lot of that is even for some folks of color, even just like the understanding of what it is, like being clear about, okay, so it's not a democratic school, but it's not a traditional public school. It's not a charter school. It's not a progressive, so like, what is it? So being able to share that information and to find out like definitively what some of the questions are in that space. Because I know in Atlanta, for example, there is very much a growing Black and brown unschooling community, specifically unschoolers. And there's a lot of work being done to collectively, to get those people together in the different pockets all throughout different parts of Metro Atlanta. And I just wonder whether Agile Learning Centers like yours could be a great resource if only they were aware of it, and if only there was just some lines of communication that were being nurtured so that we could understand what the barriers are and help figure those out,
Yeah. Else that we're toying with, so we've looked at stuff like programming and like logistics as well. We are in talks about sort of, in a way, extending our hours for the next year, because like some families, their dynamics of their work schedules, they might need longer childcare than what like our school provides. And at the moment, we don't have a formal relationship with any aftercare programs. So that we are experimenting with aftercare next fall for a few months and seeing if that is something, if like we offer that's on the website, it's a part of our like normal build out, if that might also impact families of color in a wider socioeconomic class.
I hear you. Julia, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to add a few things in. Another piece is that we've been looking at too is like if a family of color comes to an info session night and is interested in the school, we're much more willing to scaffold with them around if self-directed education is new to a family, we want to be able to like really provide that family, if it's a family of color, with education and really kind of go the extra mile to see if it's something that they're, that really calls to them. Mm-hmm. Whereas we generally as a policy don't do that with too many other families because we have to conserve our resources. And it's usually a question of, are you ready or you're not ready? But if it's a family of color that expresses some interest, we're just much more willing to scaffold. Additionally, we're also have been really committed to having conversations with the students themselves when issues of race come up. And that's been really nice to just commit to that, really listening to that and attuning to that and speaking up and directing and using resources and such that are available to us. For instance, just I guess it was 4 or 5 weeks ago, a student said, why do we have Black History Month? And so it was awesome because like the next day, Anthony came in with like a presentation of, well, here's why. So just grabbing moments like that and going with that interest. And the other thing is also staying connected to current families too. Like once we had the original diversity training, I think the thing that was so key about that was that the people we brought in they're really clear that the work is based on personal connections with other people. And so they moved from that place. So they didn't go immediately to like wrapping around the cognitive understanding, but instead straight to the personal relationships that our group has with each other. So it strengthened those relationships, and I think made it safer, particularly safer for the white families to be able to talk about race instead of feeling like it's so taboo or scared to do such. So it's like race is now allowed to be a conversation that we have as a
which
community.
is so important. Yeah, which is so very important. Yeah. And I hear you. And I know that it can be tricky, especially with the idea, like so many other self-directed education focused spaces, whether they're cooperatives or like ALCs, where there's this dance between convince and convey, right? Like it's not about saying, yay, I think that you really would enjoy self-directed education, or fielding questions from folks who really are not ready, no matter what race they are, but also recognizing that there are very different reasons why a white family may say, oh, no, there's not enough structure here, or where a Black or brown family might have challenges with the model, or even the staff coming from the background. A lot of us have a lot of negative experiences with white teachers and our Black children, or even us as young people coming up through the school system. So even being able to have that conversation, being really clear on what the obstacles are for different families.
Yeah. One of my commitments is to once or twice a week have an offering that's connected to our diversity and inclusion initiative. So, there's offerings in the space that kids can opt into. So I just be sure to make those available every week. Some of them are really obvious and some of them are more subtle around the topic. And it's interesting because something that Anthony and I are really coming up against right now is the reality that because we're offering based and because we're self-directed, there's kids that can opt out of these things. And in that way, they at times really miss crucial conversations, and a lot of times that's the older white boys will just be like, that's not about me, which is simply not true. So we're kind of like, having to look at how do we come up against that? How do we structure ourselves so that we're addressing. And so our first iteration of that is going to be sitting down with the older students and talking about, like, this is the problem. If you're not interrupting this paradigm, you're just buying into it. Our guess is that you don't want to be quote unquote accidentally racist as a grown person. So we're suggesting that you participate in it in this way, in your own dismantling in this way. And we'll see how that goes. But that's kind of, something that we're up against right now, being a self-directed environment where nothing is technically required.
Yes, I hear you, which goes right back to just the benefits of having a more diverse body of learners, because those things can happen a lot more organically just from interaction, and friendships being formed, or the opposite. And, just the natural things that we know as folks who are immersed in self-directed education, how learning happens without us having to stage anything or require anything or nudge anybody. The more they're in that space together, the more that can happen. And also not just for the learners, but also for the families as well, the parents, and especially because you have, which I think is so great, like parental involvement in that way, it will really make room for that in a very organic way that's so necessary.
Yeah, I'm kind of one of the things that's sort of emerging right now is actually tonight there's a meeting. I don't know if you know Kara's book, but the group Showing Up for Racial Justice is
Tara's books. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they're hosting a meeting for white parents tonight, and so there's three of our white parents are going, which is really exciting. That's a shift from earlier in the year for sure. And it's a shift from the work that we're doing very intentionally.
Yes, that is good to know. And then I wonder, for folks listening to this, because I'm always talking about Heartwood as I'm talking to folks in Atlanta who are working on their own cooperatives around self-directed education, or even just helping each other out in the space. I wonder what, if anything, can other folks immersed in self-directed education in and around Atlanta do to help? What are some of the things that you need that you're not getting, where you feel stuck? Some of the things you mentioned in terms of not knowing what some of the barriers are, or trying to do the dance with figuring out what's happening, what the community needs and how to be a part of it in a way that is helpful, not intrusive, and those sort of things. What do you guys need?
More families of color.
Right back, right? Beginning of the statement.
We're right back to right back to
or volunteering, like would volunteership help? Is that
anything.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we're in the process of hiring too, and I think we both feel pretty strongly that it would be amazing to have a third staff that was a person of color. That would make a difference in the demographic, because of course it's white women in education is the status quo, quote unquote. So it would be really nice to have somebody in that position. Volunteering would be amazing. We have our enrollment numbers are up. I think since you visited last, we've added 6 students of color.
Oh, wonderful.
I'm trying to remember when you visited. We're up to 30% now.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really, really, really such a gift. And I don't know if that's because we can't tell if it sort of happened very quickly after we stated our initiative. And so we kind of can't tell if it's just this wild coincidence of the universe or if it's something we directly did. But we did have 6 new students of color come in, but then it's kind of stopped after that.
So how did those families find out about you guys?
See, this is probably due to our lack of marketing completely, because one family, our friends and prior associates of when we were at Sudbury, and some of the families that were at Sudbury and friends of Julia's specifically, another family, they were referred to us from their school director because we were closer to them, and their school director is somebody that Julia and I know professionally, and then I think the other cases were their parents were friends of a set of parents that we have currently.
So it was still very much
all word of mouth.
Yeah, it's all word of mouth, and because I know this, I'm connected to this person, I know a place, and I'll refer you to here. So it's always been somebody who is somehow connected to a existing family that we have.
I see. Well, I mean, I think that's really great still, because again, the more diversity you have in the space, then the more those people can tell their people. And it also makes us feel safer in a sense. It can be really scary to have your Black kid be the one of 3 in a space versus, versus the seventh one or that sort of thing. So even the visuals, even seeing more of it on Instagram and Facebook, those sort of things would be helpful. And also being able to develop those relationships organically. And as I said, again, I feel like one of the big gaps, a lot of times we talk about the gap or the intersection of increasing diversity. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to reach out to the spaces where there are people of color who are, I don't want to say on the fence, but again, a lot of the Black and brown homeschooling communities, or I know for a fact that Atlanta has Black unschooling communities or grouped ones that I've some of them have been on the show as well, where they have unschoolers in that space or homeschoolers who would totally be open to something like what Heartwood does, what ALCs do. So I think that's a big part of how we do it too, to be really deliberate about reaching out to those folks and saying, either going on one of the outings with them a day that they're at Piedmont Park and finding out what's good or what's not. To me, those are really simple ways to not leave it to chance, but to be a lot more intentional about making sure people know that you all exist and that you're available and that you want to know what the barriers are in that space,
So I don't know if this is appropriate to ask because I know we're in the middle of a podcast, but I have so many questions about what you just said.
Totally. Let's ask the questions, Julia.
Because I really want to get very practical about that.
Yeah.
So I'm familiar with the Anna Julia Cooper Learning and Liberation Center. They're amazing. And I'm actually supposed to meet with Tamika soon to just chat about where they're at. But I have to say, neither of us we don't feel like we can find other people. And I know they're right in front of our face, but it's there's just this sense of where else do we go?
If we could find the people, if we knew how to find them to ask the question information that we wanted, we actually wouldn't need to ask the questions and get the information that we wanted, because the issue is finding them.
Yeah, I hear you, Anthony. So then just talk about being practical. Leslie Bray over at Kid Cultivators, which is a homeschooling collective, but they have a good blend of different folks in there too, including some folks who were at one point, I don't know whether they still are, radical unschoolers. They identify as radical unschoolers. I'm constantly referring people who message me about finding groups like that in Atlanta. So are you guys connected with them on Facebook, Kid Cultivators?
No, I don't know them at all.
Okay.
You referred them to me. You've referred me to them before, so I am
okay,
on
cool.
their Facebook page.
They've been around for quite some time, and it's Leslie Bray, who she was on the podcast too, and on the show notes page, I'll just find it before
I'll go
we
find
get on.
that.
And I'll connect you guys on Facebook. That's what I'll do for sure. I'll connect you guys on Facebook. And Tamika Middleton is such a great resource. So I'm glad that you guys are connected to her. She's definitely like a bona fide unschooler and probably gets a lot of inquiries from other folks who are in that space as well. Those are some good starting spaces, because I hear you, because all the time, I mean, still to this day, people are still like, oh my God, a Black unschooler, like I'm the Black unschooler. I'm like, oh my God, please stop it. But, you know, and I'm sure y'all know this too, there are a lot of, you know, like what's happening now with Kiara Harris, even though she's not an unschooler, as a homeschooler, the woman in Buffalo who's taken, right? There are a lot of reasons why we are not as happy-go-lucky about being like, oh yeah, our kids are not in school, right? There's a lot of practicality around why some of us tend to be under the radar, because it doesn't feel safe, and it isn't safe. But I do think that Tamika and Anna Julia Cooper Learning and Liberation Center, as well as Leslie Bray over at Kid Cultivators, are two very good starting points, especially Kid Cultivators, because they've been around for a very long time and they do a lot of things. There are a lot of activities that they do in and around Metro Atlanta, specifically in Atlanta proper, that I think will help to increase access to folks that you guys can really start to be in communication with about what's happening and what their needs are and whether ALCs can help.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Two other things that just popped up for me in terms of the efforts that we're sort of working toward. We have had a few of the white women on the board mention that we need more board members of color, which is also really awesome to hear coming from these women, that it's a really clear, like, oh, this is a place where we can change power dynamic. So that's like definitely something that's emerging very natural, you know, very organically, that's not having to even come from me and Anthony. We've actually both been kind of even quiet about it.
So are there folks of color on the board now?
Anthony.
There's two of us.
Okay. And how many people are on the board?
Are there 7 now?
7 or 9? 7?
Okay.
I think we're down to 7 now, yeah. We started at 8.
Okay.
Yeah, well, they're all founders too. You know, this is the very person we started with, is our founders group was so intensely white that of course that's how it, you know, the word of mouth from the founders group is just, it grows in that direction unless we're intentionally interrupting that.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you used that specific phrase, Julia, about intentional interruption, because that's absolutely what it takes. You know, I get these sort of questions a lot from white women and men, mainly white women, who listen to the podcast and say, well, how can we help with this and that? And it's like, the first thing is to bring in the people of color, like to not poke at the issue from the outside. If you're not intentional about it, then it won't happen. So it's to be intentional about interrupting what's happening in the space and to say, you know what, I don't know. And I don't think that I can really understand what the needs are in the space. So I need to find people who will be able to communicate that and to help me to solve that, which is to bring in the energy of people of color who are in the space as well. And it does take work and it's necessary. That's one of the things that I really appreciated from the very beginning, even when we were in communication via email, all three of us, that we didn't skirt around this idea of what is the issue here with diversity, because we know that's constantly going to be a thing. So what are the things that are being done about it? And I really appreciate that you guys are not tiptoeing around that sort of thing, and that you do see the obvious need and the obvious lack, and that you are, seems like being a lot more intentional and deliberate about fixing that problem, because that's exactly what it is. It's a problem.
Yeah, we had this really fantastic weekend this past weekend. At least that was, you have to say what your perspective was, Anthony, but we did a regional meetup at the ALC, and
was that the one in Black Mountain or something like that?
Yeah.
I heard about that. Yeah, I heard about that.
Yeah, that was, I mean, Anthony was who really got it started.
Oh, word?
And
yeah,
you know, he was just really responding to, at least from my perspective, you were responding to the sort of loosey-goosey nature of the original itinerary. and I forget how you said it, Anthony, but something like, I'm not about to drive up into the hills of North Carolina for some agenda that like is not like, I'm not going to show up to hang out with a lot of white people in the hills of North Carolina. I don't know why you would think that was okay to ask me to her that. And then from that, emerged a tighter agenda, and one of the very specific agenda topics was really about like, why are there so few Black and brown families in the ALC network? Mm-hmm. And that was cool to have that, like you were saying, instead of tiptoeing around it, to have that conversation in the very center of the room. And it was responded to with a lot of action items.
Anthony, tell me a little bit about if you care to share your perspective on that. How did that go?
I mean, so it came about, I guess, to clear up, like, I definitely wasn't the person who like called for the event or anything. And being invited and seeing the itinerary, I was just kind of very put off. Sometimes there are these things or cultural things that are happening. And like, I think at first I just expressed to our board and also to the folks organizing how like, not really liking this. And sometimes there's like a tendency to be, you wonder, is this a race thing? I'm not sure. Am I making this thing? Or
yes,
am
I hear you.
So you're always kind of wondering. But then I just thought like really deeply and really hard about it, and just it felt like stronger my conviction, especially after like asking a friend and saying like, does this argument hold up? And so then I said, some of the way we were going about this event is just, it makes, for me specifically, and I think it's related to the color of my skin in my socioeconomic class and just like the culture that I come from, this event and the things around it, it's hard for me to exist comfortably in this space and to do these things, which most Black people know that they're going to deal with in any, sector of life when it comes to the States, especially if it's not like explicitly for African Americans or people of color. I mean, I voiced that opinion and shared that. And then the response was that, okay, well, wait, we want to redo this, and that's not what we want to perpetuate. So I was asked to co-facilitate and be a part of the conversation. The schedule was redone with some of the things that I said in mind. And then there was a significant portion of our conversation that day that was around the model, our approach to education, and how it deals with ethnicity and talks about ethnicity and racism and oppression and how privilege operates and what that means, and like what age you start having those conversations. I think it was a really good conversation. We ended actually, okay, well, we can't solve all the problems in, just this 1.5 hour conversation, but what can we do? Like, how do we end this portion of the conversation? So we, as a means to end it, everybody stated an action plan, a specific action plan for their self, something that they could and would actually do, and that was doable within the next like 7 days. And we went around in a circle, everybody shared what they could do as it related to this theme of equity and justice and diversity and inclusion and engagement. Everybody shared, and it was like everybody had an action plan, something that they would do. And it was written down in a Google Doc that we all have access to. And then everybody shared like different resources and information that they had related to the subject, whether it was about like people who could do workshops and training on diversity and inclusion, or organizations, curriculums, things like that. So now that everybody has that, and then I can see, and I can actually hold other people accountable. They can hold me accountable for like action plans that we said we'd accomplish in the next 7 days. So
exactly. And that's wonderful, because when you talk about something as with so much potential power, like the Agile model, I think there's really no way to hold that up to real life if we're not having these conversations around ethnicity and around this sort of social justice centered consciousness. How do we do that? To me, it would be the opposite of this idea of this liberatory learning model, if we're still in this little box of whiteness in that sense. And it just goes back to that same thing for me, that one of the things I'll continue to say is that I don't think that white people should try to solve the problem without people of color. I don't think that you should sit on an all-white board or in a room of all white people and try to figure it out. I think you have to absolutely invest in the voices and the experiences of people of color, not just the dead ones in books, but the ones who are here now, to help to convey and to, you talk about things like scaffolding and to really help to understand because even what you were talking about now, Anthony, a moment ago when you said there are a lot of things that we know as Black folks that we deal with all the time with certain spaces where it's like, damn, am I going to really have to bring this up again about whether or not this is a race thing? Because I know how that comes off. And, then you get to the point where you're like, you know what, but I have to share where I am, and I have to say what isn't working for me. And so like these sort of things can't happen if someone else is supposing what may or may not be. And so it's really important that there are Anthonys on the board that are willing to speak up and say, look, here's what needs to happen. And my perspective on this is just as valid as yours and needs to be a part of this experience if this is what we say we're doing. So,
yeah, one of the attendees, it's not what she said, but it's a quote, something another woman told her, and it was the phrase, "Don't talk about me without me." So it's really, it's like it rhymes and it's really cute, but it makes total sense. And
yes,
it is the correcting sort of there's a really great article that I have about the white savior industrial complex.
Yes.
And it just deals with one, diversity. That word, that understanding, that concept is very Eurocentric anyways, but just the nature of like wanting to increase the equity and justice and reaching out and like all that. I'm getting a little preachy, but like urban outreach and like certain kinds of schools, I won't say specific, that talk about grit and rigor and how they're going into inner cities and they're going to do this for the kids and stuff. And they tell the tragic stories of inner city kids, but the people who are coming up with this stuff are not from the communities of these inner city kids.
Exactly.
And solutions to problems that, just the concept, and this is, Julia, you can provide more information to where we got this from, but like the concept or the idea of design thinking or designing a system or a solution for a population that you're not a part of and that you don't understand, it's already an inherently flawed and oppressive and racist because you are projecting problems onto that community. There might be problems there that you aren't perceiving, or the problems that you perceive, they don't perceive as problems. And so by coming to them with these solutions for problems that they don't actually perceive, you are just like forcing another racist and oppressive sort of system onto them.
Yes, and calling it a solution. And I'm glad that you brought up the white savior complex, because that's exactly what happens. And I love that. Don't talk about me without me, because that's exactly what I'm saying. And when every time these things are posed to me, these questions about how do we help Black people with liberation or stop, that's the first thing. We're not looking for saviors a lot of times because white people hold a position of power in the sense of like having the space or the resources in certain industries, in most industries. Then the first thing that you can do is to include people of color. Again, not just study James Baldwin or whatever, shout out to James Baldwin, but I'm saying the ones who are here now, to bring those people in and to not think that you can sit together and decide what may or may not work without the actual people that you're saying that you want to be useful to or that you want to include. Anthony, to the article that you mentioned, I'd love to include that in the show notes page if you can find it.
Yep.
Julia, did I hear your voice in the mix?
Oh, I was just agreeing with the things you were saying.
Okay.
I will jump in real quick to say I took this really fantastic workshop when we went to a 4.0 meetup in February, and it was called Designing for Equity. And it was really I think very granular in terms of that concept of designing for communities that are not your own. Mm-hmm. And because it really went into, it's not just having people of color at the table when you're talking about people of color, but it's also getting very grainy about, if we're designing this thing for your community, we want to hear your voice, but then who's actually making the decisions? Do you want to be at the decision-making table? Do you want us to design something for you and bring it back to you and you give feedback on it? Do you want to participate in designing something?
Right.
All of these different subtleties and variables, so that it was such a great workshop to really get really clear about. There's so many levels that this very question comes in.
Yeah.
So it's not it's not just taking feedback, and then going
right. Absolutely. And the same thing you would do in a group of white people. It's not any different. Like they don't just want to sit there and nod their heads or whatever. It's, yeah, we could go on and on till the break of dawn because I love this topic. I was actually working on a piece around this very topic of people who are saying that they want to be like allies in the space. I get the question a lot specifically around people of color and self-directed education. And I get the question so often that I'm actually working on a piece that started out as an essay. And now I'm like, I don't know if it's a workbook or I don't know what the hell it is, but I just want to have the conversation as often as freaking possible to say that the first thing is to invest in the resource, to start to look at people of color as a resource, that not a resource that you take from, but one that you invest in to build out what is happening here, which is a very different mindset. And a part of me doesn't get why it is so complicated. Cause it's like, if you saw people as
simple,
if you saw people as people, you would know that you wouldn't want to sit at a table and be a token anything. So,
right.
But I get to that. Y'all just don't have a lot of practice with that. And so it's going to take a lot of these sorts of conversations and people being able to step outside of their feelings of discomfort to put the work before the feelings, which I know, even from the parenting perspective, practicing liberatory parenting gives me a lot of practice in that sort of thing, putting the work before my feelings and just really opening up the space for white people to do the same thing. Be like, there's no way that it's going to be comfortable and you need to figure out how to be all right with that,
Yeah. And I feel like you really went to the center, the heart of the matter, which is the tendency of white socialization and white culture and white people to not see the humanity in people of color. And it's painful to say that out loud. I think about that for me in being white and working with children of color, and it doesn't happen as much now, but I think certainly when my consciousness around the issue was first beginning to raise was like just down to things like seeing the humanity in, when I would see a kid of color wrestling with a white kid, like I had to stop myself and break down what was happening in my head because the socialization was in there to see the African American child as somehow an aggressor. Like I was peeling away his humanity, and it was just like, oh, it's so painful to admit that. But all that, I'm white, it's all in there.
And it's important that we're saying it and discussing it and making safe space for these things to be explored, because as I said, that is a part of the fear, that is a part of the apprehension for those of us, even looking at those sort of spaces, because we were the Black kids in the classes with the white teachers who, the last episode I talked about this, where I was constantly being kicked out of my classes because of white teachers who try to treat me like I didn't have any sense or that I was aggressive or crazy or whatever the hell. And I saw that wasn't happening with the white students in the class. And so, so there's a lot of that, there's trust, when you talk about self-directed education and trusting the process, a lot of times what I think that facilitators in y'all's position may not understand, Anthony may, is that it's less about trusting the process of self-directed education and more so trusting that the facilitators will see the humanity in our children and give them the space to be themselves the same way they would a white child. That is a part of the problem. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So this is good. I'm very glad to hear. Yeah. Thank you guys so much, Anthony and Julia, for being willing to have the conversation. I really, really, really appreciate it. And I know that it's going to be beneficial because I feel like we just really need to have more people who are willing to have these conversations out loud so that we can start other conversations that you and I and the three of us will never be part of, but they will be beneficial to other communities as well, because this is the tricky stuff that needs to be approached in order for us to really create social change. So
one last thing I'm realizing, and it was something that it's a note or a thought that I came up with before I mentioned Saturday, and it was about asking yourself really hard questions and getting down to the grit of, or like the fine detail of like what you're doing and how it might be perpetuating systems. Scott Speed talks a lot about systems, and I think that's what people get caught up as in racism, about like it being interpersonal stuff. And I mean, now in today's political climate where certain things aren't so correct, it's like, well, no, it's not going to be interpersonal, but there's still these systems in place and these cultural habits and abilities and privileges that people put in place or establish as norms that exclude other people. And so something I said Saturday was how people of privilege, when creating a special and separate space that they might like more, they can at times create an environment that suits them better, but then they also create an environment that it excludes or makes it difficult for people who don't have that same privilege to exist in. And so sometimes it comes down to like little details about like hours of operation, and changing one of those things. It's like, well, this isn't you might not think that that's something related to ethnicity or socioeconomic status, because it's not on the surface, but it is, as I said, racially correlated. So when there's a high percentage of a certain type of people that sort of systemically cannot attain and exist in this space because of this parameter, then you do have a system, you have created an institution that is excluding certain kinds of people.
Exactly, and perpetuating that issue. Yes.
Or not is not even the point.
Yep.
It's like that awareness, that sort of approach to things.
Yes. Thank you for saying that, Anthony. It's so true. And then it just goes right back to the reason to be deliberate and diligent in including more people of color, because you won't be able to see. You know, that's a lens that you will develop from, as we were talking about before, like the reason for increasing the diversity in the learner population. You have to do that so that these things can form, so that your lens can be adjusted by experience, not something you read, not something you watch, but by having the experience over and over directly with the people who are influenced by this thing. So you can say, oh shit, that never occurred to me. Well, if it would never occur to you, which is why you need to have other people in the space who can say, hey, whether this occurs to you or not, here's how it's occurring to me and so many other people who have a similar experience that I have. And here's how it shuts us out. So that's why it's important to not try to simulate anything or solve it, but to be inclusive in a way that allows for these things to form.
Tweet your feedback using the hashtag POC in SDE, as in people of color, in self-directed education.
I want to say something, and this is obviously coming from a white perspective.
Sure.
Something that's been kind of on my mind recently too is about how do we build we have this, I'm thinking of the ALC network, because that's what we're in, which is generally made up of white people, and we're attempting to build diversity into that network. And it just raises the question for me actually around identity development. And for kids as they're moving into those middle school years, how do we support children of color when they start experiencing things differently than their white peers do? So like one thing that sort of is on my mind is this concept of what I refer to as code switching, where you can switch from one environment to the other, you know, and there's this sort of freedom you have in a self-directed learning environment. I mean, as simple as, and maybe this is too extreme of an example, but as simple as playing with water guns. You know, when you're a 13-year-old Black boy in a self-directed learning environment, it should be safe to play with water guns. But as soon as you step out of that space, that's not a safe behavior anymore. Obviously, long before 13, that's not a safe behavior. But, you know, and that's probably a really, really big one, because obviously a family is going to be really clear about that behavior for their child. But how does the school itself how does this self-directed learning environment address the kind of code switching that may be essential for safety if you're a child of color?
Yeah.
Does that make sense, that question?
Yeah. I think so. I mean, I think I get what you're saying. So when you talk about code switching, right? Like how I understand code switching is very much, and maybe we're talking about the same thing. I think that people of color specifically, we're groomed to wear that mask to make ourselves appear safer, you know, in the face of whiteness, or more human, like the way we might all the time. I used to make fun of my mom all the time about job interview speak. Like I always knew when she was talking to a white person or somebody that could employ her on the phone, because she sounded very different than if she was talking to a person of color. And not just a Black person, but a person of color. Or respectability politics are tied into that as well. You know, how we dress and all of these different things. And so again, it just, for me, and Anthony, I would love to get your perspective on this if you have something to add. But for me, I think that a person of color is the person who could address that. So you can have all kinds of discussions and you can read great things about it and that sort of thing, but you need other Black and brown people in the space to be able to speak from that experience to say, because it depends. There is no one right or wrong answer. You know, what is the context that that child is having with guns, the water gun, or where they're playing or who they're playing with. Those sort of nuances cannot be addressed with this like checklist thing of answers. So I feel like there it is again, this idea of deliberate and diligent inclusion of people of color so that you can have those conversations and then you follow that person's lead. That's what comes up for me. Because I wouldn't feel comfortable with a non-person of color saying to my Black child that, you know, this is how this will be viewed this way. Like it would be threatening, in my opinion. So Anthony, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So my response or my hope, thinking about all the parties and entities at play in a situation like that, the school, so us, the facilitators, there's the students, and then there's their parents. And I mean, because it is a thing, it is a commonality, it is a link for most families of color, there's a certain conversation that parents tend to have. I mean, at this point, it's definitely a trend because there are videos, cartoons, memes, and jokes about it. But so like, a student, two 10-year-olds, age 10, two 10-year-olds, one white, one of color, and they're out and about, they're doing something, there's water guns or something involved. Mm-hmm. And I mean, in my experience, what I assume or would think would happen in a private conversation or at home is a parent telling their child, hey, that works at home, but that works at school. You can do that at school. Fine. You're having fun. It's a protected, secure environment. But when we're out in the world, that's not going to fly. You can't do that. And maybe the child, depending on age, just listens, says, okay. But then at some point, there's an honest conversation about it. Yeah, your friend's doing it. They do it. That's fine. They're white. Society treats them a certain way. You being a person of color, you can historically and even like in the last couple of years, you're not going to get the same kind of innocent stamp put on you. Right. People are going to respond and approach you differently. So for me, like that's a conversation I could have, but at the end of the day, I'm just like the educator. For me, that's like in parent territory where a parent needs to have that honest conversation or typically has that honest conversation with their kid. So that's how I see that going. And as a school community though, we can have that talk, we can talk about that. But then as far as like what we actually practice, I mean, for me, that comes down to a very hard decision. And that's one of those decisions where do we want to be able to like have our kids enjoy and be, free and innocent and play with water guns any type of way at school, but then it's not the same experience and it's not comfortable for every student or every student can't get the same ease.
Right. So which is why I just can't see how you can avoid it. And I think especially in a case when we're not talking about a traditional school setting, when we're talking about places like Agile Learning Centers who are so deliberate about things like culture creation and connectedness to self and community and these sort of things, that it has to be inclusive in a way so that someone can speak from personal experience in a way that isn't going to be threatening to minimize the risk, because you can't say for sure whether something is going to be threatening because every individual is different. We're speaking in a lot of generalizations here. But that it's really important to have that sort of mix of what you'll get in the real world instead of this whitewashed version, so that you can have the conversation and speak from experience and even draw on, to Julia's question, to draw on examples. As you can say, we all know, we've all seen the memes and all of these things that are kind of like the ha hell funny, like the not funny funnies, because we know that it's going to be different, because by the time a little Black or Latinx boy is 7 or 8 or 9, then really he's viewed by the people in power as a 22-year-old threat,
right.
to their white child or their white daughter specifically. And that we need to be able to have these conversations, and that if it's coming from a person of color, then it isn't going to be like, there's to me, less of a likelihood of it being threatening, whether it's low key or straight out, than if it's coming from like my experiences where I had white teachers telling me that they felt threatened by something that I said, when I know that another child in the class who was white said something like that or much worse and didn't get that. So so that's what I think, Julia. My roundabout answer is that to me, that goes right back again to being really diligent about including other people so that you can have experiences with it, and so that you can, in a sense, sort of attempt to mirror the reality of life outside of the school, so that you can have those conversations about code switching from somebody who can really actually talk about it,
Yeah. No, it's funny. Like right after I asked the question, the answers sort of seem so obvious. But I think sort of what was up for me within that question too is, if our environment is so, you use the word whitewashed, which is kind of, I think, articulates what I feel in some ways. Our experience of self-directed learning is so whitewashed. How do we address the fact that we have, people of color in this environment that are not responding in the same ways? But the sort of obvious answer is you just need more people of color in the environment.
Right. And I don't think, and I'm glad you brought it up still, because, as you said, even you have the question and a lot of other people have the question too. So I appreciate that you asked the question. And I really just feel like the more we make room for that inclusivity, and not in a sense of like a favor. I feel like a lot of times it feels like that too. There's tokenism involved, and then this idea of like doing somebody a favor. It's like, no, if this is what you say that you're doing, then that's a part of your responsibility. There's a level of accountability to mirror the reality of the world without trying to be the leader of the space and trying to put everything through your lens of what it may or may not be, and actually finding out what it is and bringing in the people who can speak the language and who can say, look, here's what's happening.
Yeah.
The show notes page for this episode is akilasrichards.com/plain, PLAIN.
Man, this was really such a juicy conversation, and I very much appreciate both of you, Anthony and Julia, for making time and being open to discuss it. I've been telling Anthony for the longest, I'm going to try to back up Anthony and be respectful, but I really feel like you should have something where I can read or listen to or whatever your thoughts more often, like consistently. Because
maybe I'll start next week, because at this point, too many people have told me pretty much, or it's come up pretty much every day for the last.
I'm so sick of you. I'm so sick of you. Like, I need to have your voice more consistently. I've even said, can you be on the podcast more often? Can we just talk about things that are happening? But I'm just going to back up, for now. But
no, totally. I was like, sure, definitely.
But then I didn't hear from you again. No, let me put you on Front Street on the podcast, Anthony Galloway. But yeah, so I definitely would love to talk to you more, because I love that you're so willing to share from a perspective that I think is necessary and also very nuanced, that I just find refreshing. And I feel like your voice needs to be in the space a whole lot more, because you are very much like purple unicorny to a lot of people, like this idea of, and you know this already. So I'm going to work on that. I'm going to low key work on that some more.
That was such a great description, though, purple unicorny.
Yeah, and Julia, as always, it's a pleasure. I love your spirit, and I'm very much looking forward to just continuing to learn what's going on over there at Heartwood ALC and how we can help to grow it.
Akila, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for listening to Farrah the Free Child podcast. Like the show? Then show your love or give your feedback at akilasrichards.com.